Hi, good evening. Before we begin, I've got a few announcements before I introduce Victoria. Perhaps as some of you know, you've seen some posters up. The Berlage Institute in Amsterdam is coming for 10 days to Los Angeles. They have a course about Los Angeles this spring term. I was in Amsterdam during February to meet with them for 2 days to discuss sort of urban and conceptual issues about Los Angeles prior to their coming. They'll be here during primarily that week that Wheel Loretz will be lecturing, the last one of the term. And we have a series of events which you'll see posters on, but on Wednesday we have lectures at 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock on April the 8th. The title of the whole kind of drop, as it were, this time is called Going Horizontal, exploring the relationship of the Dutch landscape in relation to our landscape and the horizontality of the kind of relation, let's say, between Southern California and the Randstad of Holland. They'll be coming, and I just wanted to also remind all students that 16 of their students, if possible, would really appreciate you putting them up. They'll all be bringing sleeping bags. In my assistant's office, Kathy Gum, if you're interested in helping out, please see her to sign up and offer a floor for their students. We really need that because I think we'll be establishing ourselves a good exchange program with them. And I think that week will sort of culminate the kind of Dutch invasion, as it were, this semester. The other thing I wanted to hold up here is, I feel like a priest. Tells you what my background is about. This book is from the center, which Margie Reeve developed along with April Greiman, and Margie spent 3 years of a lot of hard work putting this together. It contains how many faculty? 52 faculty, some of whom aren't teaching presently, of their work. It's published by Monticelli Press. It'll be out in a couple of months in bookshops. And I just want to express my thanks to you, Margie, and to your hard work and dedication. And there are copies here, and it would be great if you came in to kind of check it out. Okay. Victoria Meyers is in partnership with Thomas Hanrahan. And they have, I think, one of the most impressive practices operating in kind of contemporary architects in sort of middle career, as it were. Victoria and Tom were classmates at the GSD in Harvard, graduating in 1982. I was also a member of that class as well, and have known them for quite a long time and understand quite a bit about what their project is about, I think. Victoria has also been teaching at Columbia from 1993 to the present in the graduate school there, and also at Cornell from 91 to 95. And I think it really points to the kind of consummate practice, shall I say, that their office has, which is not only about teaching and research, but their particular work, which you'll see tonight, I think covers a lot of territory. Urban issues, tectonic issues, issues of aesthetics, issues of history, issues of modernism, of the domestic, of construction, and a kind of real, clear material practice. I think that you'll see perhaps some relation to issues of modernism, which we're trying to explore in this lecture series this year, but quite a bit different project from that of the Dutch architects, because I think there is a clear relationship to the idea of exploring space and objecthood and materiality which is perhaps more uniquely American in their work. And I think that their practice has many, many pathways toward its kind of final destination of architecture. They've won many, many awards and honors, and are I think, leading the way in many ways and inspiring firms like my own and others about teaching and practice going together very, very clearly. Let's welcome Victoria Meyers.
Thank you, Neil. I'm very grateful to be here this evening. I've wanted to come to SCI-Arc for a long time because I think that your program is so excellent. I've met a number of SCI-Arc students who have come to Columbia University's graduate school, and they're all great. So it's wonderful to be here this evening. It's great to be in Los Angeles. And I'm a little bit nervous about following the Academy Awards, but I'll see how I can do. I also would like to reiterate what Neil said, which is I am part of an ongoing collaboration, and the work I'm showing is with a partner who's Thomas Hanrahan, and most of you met him when he came here for juries recently. Now this evening I'm going to present projects which reference research, which we're currently pursuing in our office, as well as the theme of my most recent studio at Columbia's graduate school, which is sampling. And I encourage all of you to visit the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion at the Music Center here in Los Angeles, where I recently mounted a show about a month ago of my students' projects from last semester. So I thought I would start my talk this evening with a quotation from Marcel Duchamp. The great problem was the act of selection. I had to pick an object without it impressing me, and, as far as possible, without the least intervention of any idea or suggestion of aesthetic pleasure. Now, after Duchamp, and in the present moment, I think there are many changes in both art and architecture which are related to the implications of Duchamp's ready-made. And to me, the most radical impact is on memory. For me, architecture is an analog of human memory, and therefore I think it's radically affected by these implications. Construction and architecture refers not only to the physical act of building, but it also relates to narratives which are incised into the very fabric of space. So as an investigation into how architecture operates as an analog, I think it's instructive to look at how memory has changed in response to the pressures of the contemporary digital technologies that we live with today. The changes wrought by these technologies underline the degree to which Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades continue to define specific aspects of modernisms. And I think inscriptions such as time are registered in architecture through its literal structure. A structural grid, for example, can literally demarcate a specifically timed rhythm when it's calibrated by a human footstep. And I think this rhythm establishes the time of a space in a manner similar to the pulse in music. But whereas it's the playing of music that reveals the rhythm and the structure, architecture utilizes the movement of the body to establish the perspective of time. And with that, I'd like to start with my first two slides, if you could. The ambulatory of a medieval cathedral, and I'm showing Chartres and the Abbey of Chartres in the plan of Notre Dame, has a structural base which create a timed calibration of movement as you walk through the space. However, when allegorical time begins to replace literal time, the movement of the body through space is supplanted by the timing of your internal thoughts, which begin to excavate the space from within. These internal narratives displace the literal pulse of the structure and open pockets of displacement inside the space. Literal narratives create picturesque divisions at axes and other formally notated moments. The medieval cathedral, for example, is a basilican space which is cut at precise intervals by structural bays. Every bay is carved into subspaces, and each of these contain narratives which override the formal frame of the structural grid. For example, every bay represents a book from an original biblical text. The floor itself is incised by a labyrinth. These narratives override the literal pulse of the structure, and they pull the visitor into a deep field of meditation, bay by bay. In modern bays, on the other hand, in modern space, narrative also creates ruptures within the interior grid, but in a much more abstracted manner. Abstraction, in my mind, could be qualified as the act of simplifying form so that its specificity of reference has been emptied, and it makes the narratives of modern space more fluid and much more capable, for that reason, of attaching themselves to ambient references. A modern cube could be called Platonic, but it could also have its original Platonic imagery emptied out, so to speak, and be a purely self-referential empty form which is devoid of a center. I think a cube prepared with such a lack of specificity reflects the increasing placelessness of modern life. Contemporary minimalist sculpture represents a good example of what I'm speaking about, and I'm showing a still from Cirrus film and some pieces by Donald Judd. Minimalism sought to create geometrically precise form as a means of emptying out the meaning attached to sculpture. Through the act of emptying out the original meaning of the art of sculpture, artists were able to prepare a new ground, so to speak, which was capable of supporting a new language of form. Now, Duchamp's ready-mades also required this emptying out of history and meaning for the objects which he selected. The ready-made set the stage in this respect for minimalist sculpture, as well as for contemporary movements in music, including ambient music, with its use of ambient structure as a neutral field and sampling as a means of placing found sound forms into a field. And I'm showing a cover from DJ Loop's album, and this is a person who I collaborated with last semester and who I'm continuing to collaborate with in my practice. Modern architecture, in a similar manner, has moved toward increasingly empty, non-specific formal reference. The field of modernism, like ambient sound and musical composition, provides a neutral landscape for the placement of samples or selected formal reference. Modern architecture, in a manner similar to experiments in modern art and sculpture, uses a repetition of these abstracted, empty, and placeless forms as a means of underlining the lack of specificity in place in the digital field that we occupy. So in the words of Gilles Deleuze, I think you could say that it's free action, which by its essence unleashes the power of repetition as a machinic force that multiplies its effort and pursues an infinite movement, and that free action proceeds by disjunction and decentering, or at least by peripheral movement, and creates disjointed polythetism as opposed to symmetrical antithetism. So returning to my original premise that architecture is an analog for human memory, I think there's a question, which is, what is this minimal space, and what does it communicate about human memory today? And I think perhaps what it communicates is that we are, as a reflection of contemporary life, losing access to memory as it was previously understood, that we're losing access to memory that has any depth of field, but that we're gaining a new intelligence which latches on to several registrations at once, but with each registration existing as a thin, fleeting image. So that in this age of mechanical reproduction and repetition, the deep meaning of medieval space is lost. But it's an act of poetic resistance to the erosion of this cultural depth of field, which motivates our investigations into thinness and repetition as elements of a valid contemporary language for architecture. I would argue, in fact, that the generation of the field implied by the new digital technologies is, in fact, the only possible means of pursuing a valid contemporary artistic action. And within this field, I think a valid language of formal construction is possible. Structure, to me, is a divisibility of space into successive parts. I think form is content, and method is a means of controlling the continuity of form. The materiality of modern space, as with modern music, is a manipulation of pure matter and pure void. Within this new field of action, strategy has to do with the creation of a structure for arranging the repetition of matter or form within a contemporary field of action. Repetition and selection, in this case, have become the valid activities of both the architect as well as the artist. The language constituted by the selected cultural sound bites and the repetition is the syntax of a new, evolving digital culture. These syntactical operations are necessary within architecture as well if it's to develop a valid formal text for contemporary life. This text, although I think it's abstracted and empty, inhabits and questions the neutrality of this new digital terrain even as it's inhabiting it. Which brings me to the first project. Within our work, I think there are specific moments and projects where the structure of this new terrain is explored. And this is Duplicate House, which is our most direct investigation of space created through the operations of selection and repetition within a field. Duplicate House could be described initially as a simple Platonic cube. But on further inspection, the cube is not the smooth Platonic form of 18th century geometry, but it's a series of reflections and refractions which illustrate the digitized landscape and the placement of an emptied formal text within it. As in the cathedral, at Duplicate House, there's also a structural grid which orders the space. In this case, it's a 10-foot by 10-foot grid. The grid establishes a democratic space, and at first glance, it reinforces the modernist celebration of a rationalist pilotis structural system, which was established by Le Corbusier. But within this rationalist grid, I think there are embedded narratives which again usurp the clean democracy of the space. Dissimilar to early modernism, where there was a desire to have the space of the surrounding ground plane flow through the ground floor of the house, at Duplicate House we created a prepared ground where we placed the house. And this prepared ground essentially removes the precinct of the house from its surroundings. And this becomes a new ground which is capable of supporting the operations of repetition and selection. The second floor is made from forms and geometric figures which repeat in a random manner. The first floor is simply a void, and the void is minimally demarcated through the shadow of its reflection, which is hovering above. So by being pure void, the first floor becomes empty and thin. In contrast, the second floor takes on the sense of a thickened plane. I'm having a hard time getting these to go forward. Maybe I should just ask you to advance the slides. Could you advance both? So the second floor takes on the sense of a thickened plane. And in my mind, the thin space reflects back into the thick space in a situation which I think is similar to the relationship between étant donné and the large glass occurs, so that there's an inversion, so that you can imagine that the void space is the thickened space and vice versa. The constructed space of the second floor, through the sheer pressure, becomes the thin space. So with this confrontation, Duplicate House sets up within itself an irreconcilable dilemma. And with this dilemma, there comes a creative tension which makes a house a powerful space of reflection. As we move further into the 21st century and we see the shrinking and the densification of narrative and space, it's also ironically that we see the depth of field of both things emptying out. I think qualitative depth is being superseded by quantity. And it was this sheer pressure of this quantity of information that we were seeking to represent in the second floor of Duplicate House. Unlike the meta-narratives of past architectures, the poetic statement at Duplicate House is a reference to the fact of the structural condition of thick and thin, of quantity as opposed to substance. Could I have the next two slides? So within this discussion of the new digital field of action, I think it's interesting to look at how the issue of program gets resolved. The spatial and the psychological conditions of modernism are reflected, but they're also refracted by the programmed areas at Duplicate House. As a refraction of that condition, the voided first floor registers themes of publicness, whereas the packed space of the second floor is in keeping with the privacy of a boudoir. It's interesting to note that the emptied field continues to contain certain assumptions in this sense about human life. That certain elements of the traditional diagram of what a house is exists within this emptied field. At Duplicate House, a space which is capable of acting as a mirror to contemporary culture and life, for me still is contaminated by the presence of older human narratives. And I think what this says really is that there are certain aspects of human life and culture which resist erasure. Digital technologies, I think, radically alter how we communicate with each other and how we think about life. But I think certain rituals which respect, separate, and frame the difference between public and private life remain. This difference disrupts the idealized democratic field that we established at the house. Can I have the next two slides? Duplicate House does, however, resist a nostalgic rereading of 18th and 19th century themes with a new order of space, which is created out of randomly selected samplings of architectural form. And it's the operation, in my mind, of selection, which is the operative ordering device of this space and not the grid. The program of piano nobile, boudoir, and the psychological tension between them does, however, infiltrate the spatial order of the house with a more traditional registration of program, and I think that's interesting. Next two slides, please. And with respect to narrative, the 18th century promenade from the ground floor through the piano nobile is replaced with the juxtaposition between empty space on the ground floor and packed space on the second floor. Next two slides, please. This juxtaposition of thick, thin, heavy, and light invites the inhabitants of the house to explore the sensibility of space, which is as thin as air, with invisible boundaries on the one hand, and opposes to the density of packed space on the other hand. Can I have the next two slides? And the irony of the house is that these operations are juxtaposed within the confines of a form which, for all intentions, is initially simply a cube. The cube and its ramifications disappear, and its 18th century trappings are usurped through the development of the project. This development entails the creation of a dialogue which is relevant to this new field of action that I'm discussing. Can I have the next two slides? This is the Holly Loft, which also illustrates what I'm speaking about with this field of action and our inscription of form within it. The loft is a residential project where we attempted to make a new space by literally carving it out of the space of the city, which is in this case Manhattan. For the next two slides. The only full height wall in the space is glass. The glass wall acts very much like the empty ground floor of Duplicate House. Through an act of anamorphosis, this thin reflective surface establishes an implication of thinness, which on the other hand contains an infinite depth of field. Have the next two slides. When you enter the loft, this wall, which is 40 feet long, is visible only in profile. The original impression is of a thin line in space, but when you move into the space, the breadth of the plane becomes apparent. The next two slides, please. Light, space, and reflections dance through the loft, which is demarcated by the presence of an original structural grid, as well as an artificial landscape that we created, which are forms which come up out of the floor plane, which are the principal means that we use to differentiate programmed space from programmed space, so that we use maple in the floor and the same wood to create a series of cabinets, and these march through the loft and create the programmed areas. Have the next two slides. The building of form out of the ground plane again dealt with the necessity of placing the architecture of the loft into this prepared ground. Two actions were necessary for us to be able to do this. First, the space of the loft had to be cut and removed from the field of the city. And then, as a conceptual idea, a new ground was constructed within which a new terrain and a new language of architecture and architectural operations could take place. Okay, the next two slides. At the Holly Loft, as at Duplicate House, the program pressure of publicness and privateness interrupts the purely conceptual diagram that we had for the project. The programmatic necessity, however, to delineate the separation of public from private created a pressure within the formal operation of ambient space interspersed with form. Could I have the next two slides? Wood cabinetry, glass planes, and even movable wall elements act in response to both the desire to demonstrate a play between thick and thin, and at the same time they also respect these domains of public space and boudoir. Have the next two slides. The glass wall within the loft and the reflections that it contains was designed in our minds as an anamorphic device. Anamorphism succeeds in allowing the loft to contain an extreme depth of field within the confines of a very small space. The glass plane sets up a juxtaposition similar to the empty first floor at Duplicate House, so that the apparent emptiness of the minimalist language of the loft is supplanted by the richness of the internal poetics, which exists within the dialogues between the ambient forms marching through the space in a series of duplications and repetitions. The next two slides. In a manner similar to Duplicate House, the loft acts as an analog of contemporary culture. It's a space of thin, fleeting imagery created through reflection and repetition, where thick planes are juxtaposed to thin planes, and they all operate within a digital terrain of reference. Next two slides, please. And similar to the refinement of other instruments in the 20th century, I think architectural form of this kind disappears as an obstruction to the comprehension of space. I think it's changed our understanding of time as its experience in architectural space, as the liberating potential of reductive form and endless space has created a series of fleeting perceptions and momentary experiences instead. Can I have the next two slides? I think the idea of temporality is a central, but it's also a very elusive idea in our work. I think it's found at unusual points in space, and it's also found at moments of tangencies where one visual world collapses and another momentarily appears. Can I have the next two slides? I think an example of this idea is found in the painting The Two Ambassadors by Hans Holbein. This is a well-known example of anamorphosis, where a viewer who approaches tangentially to the surface of this painting watches as the ostensible subject matter disappears and a human skull jumps out of the canvas. This mask reverts to an unintelligible streak, however, as the viewer returns to a privileged frontal point of view. We have the next two slides. So I think this example suggests many things, but I think most importantly what it suggests is that our bodies are engaged with vision in very extraordinary ways, and that it's impossible to state the importance of the distant or the privileged view relative to the momentary or the tangential, because the body is engaged in an on-off positional play of viewing and not viewing within an extended field of action. So it's within this realm that perspective, I think, can radically shift, and the transient phenomena of minimal interventions can assume enormous proportions. And I'd have to say that this constant cycle of enhancement and reduction in space describes a sequence of moments in space, which is our particular obsession in our practice. Next two slides. This next project deals with what I'm going to call swift and slow space. This is an apartment that we recently completed at the Museum of Modern Art Tower in New York. And swiftness is a concept that for me is a quality that I liken to quickness. Quick means literally alive. Swift space is space which has life. It expresses the condition of life through a complex depth of field. And I'm comparing the operations we went through in the apartment to this piece by Robert Irwin called Scrimvale, in which he places a scrim in a space dividing it so that you have intense depth of field in one part of the space and shallow depth of field in the other. Slowness, by contrast, references death through a condition of negative entropy. Next two slides. Slow space, in my mind, is kind of like a black hole. It's a rupture in space and time which absorbs whatever gets within its field within a certain radius. In this case of this apartment, we saw the exterior envelope, which is opaque and absorptive, as this matte white plaster, as being a very slow space. Have the next two slides. And then there's a reflective surface of a highly polished active plane which bisects the apartment. This plane contains a movable translucent window, and for me, this is swift space. The effect is one of intense depth of field at this wall in contrast to the exterior envelope, which is matte. And this notion of depth of field references, for me, the picturesque, where there's a conscious differentiation between the middle ground, the foreground, and the background. Okay, the next two slides. And in relation to this idea of the picturesque and the questioning of the depth of a surface, there's an analysis of the paintings of Agnes Martin by Ralston Krauss that I'd like to reference. Agnes Martin spent her life making paintings which were 6 feet square and constructed of penciled lines which were applied over lightly gessoed canvases. Martin's work could be seen as referencing the sublime, especially as this concept relates to viewing distances. In viewing Agnes Martin's paintings, there's a close to reading that you can get, and then there's a second moment of viewing when you're further back, and then finally there's a third moment of viewing when you're back further. Whereas the first moment deals with the figural facts of the textures in the paintings, the second moment deals with the painting's atmospheric effects, and the third moment is a fully distant, more opaque advantage on the work, which closes the work from behind, so to speak. And I think this places you in a constant conversation in relation to the canvases between figuration, which is visible in the close to vantage point, as opposed to a reading of ground, which is where your attention shifts in the fully distant view. Okay, the next two slides. I wanted that same complexity of registration at the MoMA Tower apartment, so that a wall surface here could establish a boundary within the space, and that this is a boundary which could dissolve in relationship to your distance from it and your engagement with it, and that we could use a combination of matte and reflective surfaces to establish within the apartment a dialogue of movement through a push and pull between active, reflective, and inactive matte surfaces. So that reflective and matte surfaces, if I could have the next two slides, establish a conversation between swift, active, and slow, inactive spaces. The next two slides. The digital environment allowed us to design the space and movement, and I'm hoping that there is a dynamic link between the medium of the moving sketches, or the animations that we used to develop the project, and the spatial qualities of the final space. The next two slides. And for me, swiftness and slowness are qualities that I relate to the contemporary world and the conditions that we live with as a result of modern technologies. Swift is related to quickness and the ability to move in time and space. And I think it also references the way in which imagery becomes detached and displaced through the action of new technologies. And in this case, I'm referencing a complex mirage known as the Fata Morgana, which appears over the Arctic ice caps, so that at the moment at Tower I wanted to take this terrible but also wonderful effect of this phenomenon, and I wanted to place it into the confines of this small space. Okay, the next two slides. This is a project we did a while ago. This is called Chattanooga Nature Interpretive Center, and it's a project which is an urban building. It's a building we designed initially as a probe into nature, a building we designed as a bridge, And it's a building which is not only sited within nature, but by virtue of its program, which is a Nature Interpretive Center, it's a center for interpreting the natural setting around itself. It's a project that we designed after winning a national design competition. Have the next 2 slides. And when we were designing this project, we thought, somehow the relationship to what we understand as nature has changed. And that science has become a looser, a much broader range of studies which place the natural and the man-made into a dialogue. And then we thought, the building we're designing could mirror this new dialogue. And we thought that the scientific instrument in this case could be seen as an extension of the human body. And it could extend vision, hearing, and touch into micro and macro worlds. And for these reasons, we pursued the idea of the building as an active instrument for the body's understanding of nature and ultimately through the building itself. And in that sense, it would be a scientific probe into a natural setting. Okay, the next 2 slides. The site for the building is in Tennessee. It's just east of Chattanooga, bordered by the Chickamauga Creek to the south and railroad tracks to the north. Next 2 slides. And from the site came the second idea that we had for the project, which was this idea of the building as a bridge into nature. The area where we sited the building was where there was a deep depression because it was next to railroad tracks, and it was also at the edge of the sanctuary. So we decided we would project our building into this depression, which was a gravel pit, and it would become a bridge into nature sitting on stilts. Next 2 slides. And then we looked at the model we made, and we stepped back and we asked ourselves, what kind of instrument is this? And we began to investigate the relationship between spaces in the building and the technologies that we were incorporating. And we found ourselves pursuing an idea of a tectonic composite, of a condition where space could become very complex in response to an overlay of basic tools or technologies. And first we made a study model of this idea of imaginary instruments, and we made this collage model to my right, which incorporated the machinery that we were thinking of using to operate a large moving solar window, which would be above the entrance lobby. And the next 2 slides. The slide further away to my right shows a plan which was very simple. You entered into the building under a sky window into an orientation lobby. And the next space was a gallery. There was a permanent gallery and the changing gallery. Then there are meeting rooms. Then there is an atrium, which is an inside-outside space. And the final space in the sequence is an outdoor deck. Next 2 slides, please. At the entrance to the building, you walk under this huge sky window, which in my mind is a place for viewing up. And it's also the gate into the sanctuary. Next 2 slides. And this is a perspective view into the atrium, which is a miniature weather station as well. And this, to me, is a space of stasis, and this is a place for looking down. And this is also one of the instruments that we incorporated for reading the site. Next 2 slides. The perspective view of the entry and the tectonic composite model shows the idea that we had of projecting yourself into nature through the vehicle of the building, of viewing the sky through this large sky window and through that sky window being projected into the sky. Next 2 slides. And these final 2 slides of the Nature Center show a sort of train's eye view since it was sited next to railroad tracks. The normal view of the building is a long linear view, but if you pass it in a train, it's a sort of active time view, so you get a sort of a visual version of a Doppler effect. So this is a view from the train. Next 2 slides. I'd like to show 2 projects now which examine the concerns I've outlined in the private realm with respect to the urban and the public realm. The map and the site model show a project that our office has been pursuing for 10 years now. We've spent the past 10 years applying many of the strategies I outlined at Duplicate House, at the Holly Loft, at the scale of the city, and with the program of public space. The area of our focus has been the western edge of Manhattan, starting south at Battery Park City and continuing north to 59th Street. Our first area of investigation looked specifically at the piers at the west side of Manhattan, where we investigated the implications of extending land masses into the water. In this investigation, we dealt with the sense of the water as a surface and as ground, and with the land brought into that ground as a formal interruption. And the next set of drawings, if you could, I could have the next two slides, show a opposite strategy, and this is an investigation which we refer to as open fabric. Open fabric was a plan that we had for siting elderly housing in Lower Manhattan. As we finished building the Holly Loft, we were asked to design a residential project by Architecture magazine. They called us because we were devoting an issue of the magazine to housing for the elderly, and they had gotten such bad examples that they solicited various people to do some good examples, and we were one of them. So we thought it would be a good idea to place elderly housing in Manhattan, since most housing for this population is placed in rural areas. And the site plan shows where we sited it. Whereas I think elderly housing is the fastest growing sector of private development, I think there is a scarcity of proposals for retirement housing in the city. So as a counter-proposal, here we are in Manhattan. If I could have the next two slides. There are a number of older people, I know, who enjoy access to museums, galleries, theaters, and cultural events. And so we thought that with access to culture and institutions a priority, we should do a new elderly housing prototype in Soho near Tribeca. And the site that we chose is bounded by Spring, Washington, Greenwich, and Clarkson Streets. If I could have the next two. The spatial typology of the building complex that we designed reflects our desire to create a sense of open fabric within the dense urban fabric of New York. We used the formal expression of the proposed building complex to transform the existing streets into what we're calling warped and skewed space. So we created a whole series of warped and skewed courtyard spaces which overlay each other, and they read through different surfaces and materials, so that there's a tree-filled courtyard. There are paved spaces with free circulation between city blocks, and then there's water in a central court with a large reflecting pool. The basic concept that we had was to keep the individual housing units small and affordable. Each unit is 750 square feet, and also to open large outdoor collective spaces. The space within each of the units is subdivided by movable wall panels, which makes it a flexible interior space. And we did this after taking Tom Hanrahan's retired parents to see the Holly Loft, and they were very impressed. So we thought if they liked it, we should use it here. Have the next two slides. This slide to my far right shows a perspective view into the semi-private court. The new urban spaces between the housing blocks would be accessible buffer zones which would separate the residents from the bustle of Manhattan on the one hand, and create mini parks which would allow the residents to observe the life of the city but at a safe distance. And we created a semi-private garden park which would provide a place for strolling. And walking west from Houston Street south to Spring Street, you could encounter a variety of semi-enclosed spaces transforming from a triangular public piazza at West Houston to a tree-filled courtyard at the terminus of King Street, to a water court from King Street to Van Dam, and the final space in the north-south sequence would be a planted elliptical courtyard adjacent to Spring Street, so that the changing spatial forms would correspond to different natural settings, going from an arboretum to an artificial lake to a garden. Have the next two slides. Now, as an extension to that housing project, I'm going to show West Side Water Park, which is the second urban project I mentioned. And this occupies an adjacent site along the riverfront. It's actually 1 block away at Canal Street and at the waterfront. And this is a project which includes interventions which we refer to as the city's eye and the city's ear. It's a project that we designed in 3 parts, and we produced it at 3 different times. It began as an ideas competition for the piers at the west side of Manhattan, which was sponsored by the Municipal Art Society in 1987. And the ideas that we had were that we would transform the waterfront by projecting public institutions, libraries, public high schools, theaters, a velodrome, an institute for marine biology onto the piers. And we thought we should locate these buildings in relationship to the major east-west cross streets in Manhattan. So the sites that we chose for our intervention were starting south at Canal Street, at 14th Street, at 34th Street, and at 42nd Street. Next 2 slides. So at a larger scale and with more detail, we developed our ideas for the Civic Center at Canal Street. Now, Canal is an east-west street, which defines an edge of 2 districts in New York. There's Tribeca to the south and Soho to the north. The objective that we had was to give life to this urban edge, which had once, a couple hundred years ago, been a source of pleasure and spectacle, and until recent years had been pretty derelict, and now it's coming back. And we thought the best way of doing this would be to site public buildings at this edge and to expose the existing spaces of urban infrastructure, which are normally hidden, and celebrate them. Next 2 slides. So at Canal Street, the space for spectacle that exists is a Holland tunnel and its ventilation shafts. And these are the shafts sticking out of the water, and these became the lungs for our intervention at Canal Street. They sit in the Hudson River adjacent to our site, and the diagrammatic drawing shows the connection between the ventilation vent towers and the road tunnels going under the Hudson River. The next 2 slides. And we thought we would animate the site by rethinking the idea of the piers, anchoring the site to Canal Street with new buildings, including a school for the performing arts, a theater, New York City environmental offices, and a public piazza. And the slide to my right shows a public scaffolding in our building, and then a vertical scaffold, which is actually a building under construction, and buildings often look so much better when they are under construction before they get the cladding. But it sort of references this idea we had of a pedestrian wall like the wall at Grand Central Station. And the next 2 slides. So we wanted to establish a direct relationship between the screen that we were making at Canal Street and the public scaffold wall at Grand Central. So we were trying to create here a building which operated as a theater, which was literally animated by the life of the people using it. Next 2 slides. This shows a section cut through that Galleria screen, which we placed at the western edge of the piazza. And it also shows how this architectural piece acts as a threshold which marks an edge between the water and the city. Next 2 slides. And we use a program to enhance this idea of projecting one space onto another by placing a school for the performing arts in the building which faces the screen. And then this way we created a sort of inside-out view from the school toward that screen. Inside out meaning that it's possible to occupy 2 spaces at one time, and of decentering the architecture so that the theater screen, Galleria, can literally be an eye to the city. And for me, this idea of being inside out is like being inside a dream and seeing yourself from outside yourself, of displacing your human senses onto the architecture and that way projecting yourself into another space. Here are the next 2 slides. The dynamic relationship between these 2 elements allow you to exist simultaneously within and without the theater. This slide to my right shows a Max Ernst drawing of a camera eye which is lodged literally within the body of a person. We thought that in a similar way we could create an idea of theater as eye, or of the camera as genitalia, which would project the energy of the architectural event out to the city. The next 2 slides. The theater is also a constructional idea of literally constructing itself as a thing inside a thing, of a theater inside the wall of a new civic building at Canal Street. So in this sense, I think it's not unlike this construction photograph from the construction of the Holland Tunnel. The next 2 slides. So the theater and its performance can decenter the eye of the city. I think the final piece of Canal Street, or the next 2 slides, which is a tower which houses the former Department of Docks and Piers, which is now an environmental and social monitoring agency, could be the city's ear. And this raises a question, which is, how do you listen to the city? Look at the next 2 slides. As a monitoring device, we designed this part of the Canal Street as a tower, and the tower has a skin which contains air, light, and noise monitoring equipment. We thought this idea of aural dissociation could create a sense of decentering the city through the ear. And in this sense, the focus of the piece is similar to an art project recently sponsored by Battery Park City, where they had an artist come in with microphones and project the sound of water at the river's edge along the walkway they're creating from Battery Park to 23rd Street. So the slide to my right shows a close-up view of the tower, which is our version of the city's ear. Look at the next 2 slides. And this displaced ear is a listening device in the body of the tower, but it's also a residence for a city statistician. So we thought this displaced figure could animate the intervention at Canal Street through the presence of a specific program which places the project in dialogue with its surroundings, but at the scale of the city. Have the next 2 slides. This is the final project I'm going to show this evening. This is called Open Corner Lines of Light. It's Red Hook Community Center. It's a project that's currently under construction. The site is in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn, and the building is 2 additions, actually, to an existing community center which is adjacent to a large public housing complex which is called Red Hook Houses. The next 2 slides. At the street side of the building, this is the way the building used to look, and this is our addition. We thought this addition could give the center a new sense of identity. It would be a new entrance pavilion which, on the one hand, accommodates the handicapped and creates access to the building, but it also creates a new image. Have the next 2 slides. And at the rear of the building, facing the public housing complex, we're constructing an outdoor theater, and we're taking out the rear of the building. Have the next 2 slides. The site plan shows the scale of the adjacent public housing complex, which is home to most of the community which will be using the building, and it's just to the south of where the building's located. Okay, the next 2 slides. We've just started construction. These 2 slides show minimal construction. The front of the building was recently demolished, and we have the steel framing up for the new addition. In the next 2 slides. The site plan and the isometrics show the site strategies that we have for an open corner, which in our minds opens the site to the rest of the city. And in addition to designing a new entrance pavilion and an outdoor theater and extensively renovating the existing building, we're also designing landscaping around the building, which we thought was an important thing to do. And this comprises 4.5 acres and includes an outdoor playground, basketball courts, and the street front entrance into the building and a garden. So in order to also reconnect the building to the street, the original building was attached to an adjacent building by a shed. We demolished the shed, and we're constructing a new public walkway through this cut, which will be on axis with the center of Red Hook Houses. Okay, the next 2 slides. These sketches show how we developed our strategy of designing the building as an open corner. And one of the problems that I think you face with a community center which is attached to a housing complex is the degree to which the public feels incredibly intimidated by the presence of the public housing on the one hand, and the degree to which the people who live there feel cut off from the rest of the public. Then we thought by opening the corner of the community center and creating a new accessible entrance to the Red Hook Houses, we would alleviate that sense of fear on the part of outsiders and address that sense of isolation. Okay, the next 2 slides. This watercolor and perspective show the interior of the new entrance pavilion and The space is not only the entrance to the building, it's also a neighborhood art gallery. The watercolor shows the quality of light that we're hoping to create in the space through a large skylight, which cuts across the space and delineates the edge between the new building and the old. And the next two slides. These two slides show details of the entrance facade. The building will be limestone-faced concrete block. The major part of the elevation is glass curtain wall. And inserted into this curtain wall, we made a 12-inch deep punch, which for us articulates the sense of connectedness we're trying to establish between the outside world and the interior of the new center. For the next two slides. In addition to the art gallery, we're designing a mural in the space. The mural will be a cast glass wall, it will be just visible behind the curtain wall, and we placed it so that it's visible both inside and outside the building. And the perspective to my right shows the mural wall as well as the quality of light that we're hoping to achieve in the new entrance. And the other perspective is a massing study we made as a process sketch. The next two slides. And the plan shows how we organize the building, which has a pretty complicated program. The main space on the upper level is a new indoor theater, multi-purpose room. The stage for this interior theater also becomes a stage for the outdoor theater to the south. The rear wall of the existing building was recently demolished, and that wall is going to be replaced by a large operable panel which will open the stage out to the out of doors. It's also our intention with the redesign of this building to create a new community center that has two principal elevations, which it never had before. One to the street and the rest of Brooklyn, and the other toward the residents of Red Hook houses. Okay, the next two slides. These are model views which show the massing of the theater and the multi-purpose room, as well as the outdoor theater to the south. The next two slides. A model looking north at the new outdoor theater and a model view into the stage. And the next two slides. And this is a plan of the lower level of the building, which accommodates a public high school. The lower level has classrooms, a dance studio, a library, a multi-purpose room, and a public radio station. Go to the next two slides. And these are two renderings which show views of the new north and south elevations. Go to the next two slides. And with these final two slides of Open Corner, I'd like to consider how the language of thick and thin and transparency and reflectivity can be brought into the design of a community center for Brooklyn. Moving from south to north through the site in Red Hook, our building proposes a series of new proscenia. And the first proscenia for me really starts at the edge of the site between Red Hook houses and the building. The second proscenia occurs at the stage elevation of the outdoor theater. The third proscenia is at the elevation of the interior theater. The fourth proscenia at the skylighted edge between the new entrance pavilion and the existing structure. And the fifth proscenia occurs at the new glass entrance facade to the street. It's our desire to see the community center establish a new order of social interaction at Red Hook. So we attempted to do this through programming, through space, and through the inscription of these planes of light into and onto the site. So it's really, for me, a language of light that we tried to bring into a darkened 19th century housing complex, and through light and, I would say, enlightenment, create a new sense of hope, desire, and optimism about the future, which I think is the 21st century and which I believe is here today. So I'd like to leave all of you with these thoughts. I'd like to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present my work this evening. Thank you. We're going to do questions and answers.
Last project's great.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you can tell Andrea.